the early centuries of the Middle Ages, when Europe still trembled in the long shadow of the Dark Ages, the crowns of kings seemed to glitter with absolute authority. Castles rose on hills, lords commanded knights, and peasants bent their backs to the soil under the burden of feudal obligation. Yet beneath this grand stage of steel and stone, in the narrow alleys of growing towns and the smoky hearths of workshops, another kind of power was stirring. It was not the power of armies, nor of bloodlines, nor of divine right claimed from pulpits, but the power of the craftsman, the merchants and the laborers whose hands shaped the daily life of kingdoms. This power did not roar like a trumpet on the battlefield. It whispered in the marketplace. It clinked in the counting house. It glowed in the forge. Slowly, quietly, it took root, until its influence spread like ivy over the very walls of monarchs' palaces. And this was the birth of the guilds brotherhoods that would one day prove themselves more enduring, more feared and more powerful than kings. At first, they were nothing more than small gatherings of artisans. A handful of weavers might meet to protect their cloth from being underpriced by greedy merchants. A circle of masons might band together to ensure that the secrets of stone cutting passed only to trusted apprentices. A company of bakers might agree on a standard weight for their loaves so that none could cheat. Their customers. These gatherings were born out of necessity, but necessity is often the mother of destiny. For when men gather to protect their trade, they also begin to defend their rights, their honor, and their place in society. Out of these simple meetings grew bonds that were far stronger than the feudal chains that bound peasant to lord. The guilds, though humble at their birth, became living fortresses of loyalty, wealth, and knowledge. The 12th century was an age of rebirth, an awakening from centuries of stagnation. Cities swelled as trade revived, markets blossomed, and ships carried spices from the east, furs from the north and silks from Byzantium. Where once only castles dominated the landscape, now towns began to flourish, their streets alive with voices, their squares crowded with merchants, and their churches rising ever higher toward heaven. Kings saw these towns as sources of taxes and soldiers, but what they did not see was the subtle authority being woven by the guilds within their walls. The king might levy a tax upon the town, but the guild determined whether the town prospered enough to pay it. The king might demand ships for war, but the shipwrights decided how quickly or how well those ships were built. Slowly, almost invisibly, the guilds began to tilt the balance of power. The first secret of their strength was unity. Unlike nobles, who often quarreled over inheritance and lands, guildsmen were bound together by oath and necessity. A man who entered a guild did not merely join a professional circle. He joined a brotherhood that would protect him in times of famine, defend his family in times of danger, and uphold his name against slander. In return, he owed absolute loyalty to the guild. This loyalty was not given to kings, who could be distant and capricious, but to fellow craftsmen who worked beside him, ate with him, and swore with him before God. It was a bond so deep that betrayal was considered worse than treason to a crown. For if a man broke his oath to the guild, he did not merely lose his trade, he lost his honor, his livelihood, and his place in the world. As guilds grew, they developed rituals of secrecy. New members were not simply welcomed, they were tested, sometimes blindfolded, sometimes sworn upon relics, sometimes initiated with symbols and words that would never be spoken outside the lodge. The masons, whose work raised the great cathedrals that towered above medieval Europe, guarded their craft as though it were a holy mystery. The glassmakers of Venice kept formulas for their dazzling creations, hidden as jealously as a king guards his crown. The merchants of the Hanseatic League knew sea routes and trade practices that outsiders could never penetrate. These secrets were the lifeblood of their power, for knowledge is often stronger than swords, and the guilds understood that to share too freely was to surrender their advantage. And so, the guild halls became places of both fellowship and mystery. By day, they rang with the talk of prices, weights, and apprenticeships. By night, they glowed with candlelight as masters whispered vows and judgments. A king might sit upon a gilded throne, but within those timbered halls, decisions were made that shaped the lives of thousands. The guild could decide who would work and who would be denied, who would sell in the marketplace and who would be cast out, who would grow wealthy and who would starve. Such power, though hidden from the crowns, was immense. From the earliest days of their rise, the guilds understood a truth that even kings often forgot. Power rests not merely in wealth or arms, but in loyalty. A king might command knights sworn to him, yet those knights could betray him in exchange for land or titles. A king might tax peasants until their backs broke, yet peasants had little choice but to obey. The guilds, however, bound their members not with chains of iron or threats of punishment, but with oaths sworn in secrecy and faith. These oaths were stronger than feudal ties, stronger than royal decrees, and often stronger than the bonds of blood. To be a brother of a guild was to stand within a circle that no king could penetrate, for what was shared within the guild stayed within the guild, guarded more fiercely than any treasure chest. The initiation of a guild was no simple affair. Apprentices were often brought in as boys, chosen not only for their skill or promise, but for their loyalty and character. They were set to work under masters who tested them not only in craft, but in patience and humility. Years would pass before the apprentice was considered ready to take his place as a journeyman, and even then, acceptance was not merely a matter of skill. It required an oath, spoken before witnesses, often before holy relics, that bound him to the brotherhood for life. He swore never to reveal the secrets of the trade, never to undercut his fellow brothers, never to betray the guild's will. Breaking this oath was unthinkable, for it meant dishonor, exile, and ruin. The guild was not simply an employer, it was one's protector, one's judge, one's family. Every guild had its own rituals. Some were simple, the recitation of words passed down from generation to generation. Others were more elaborate, blindfolds placed upon the initiate, symbolic tasks given, even the touch of tool's hammer, chisel, knife placed into his hands as tokens of his craft. In some guilds, the initiate drank from a shared cup, symbolizing the unity of the brotherhood. In others, he was made to place his hand upon a sacred book or upon the altar of the local church, swearing not only before men, but before God himself. In this way, the oath was not merely legal, it was spiritual. To break it was not only to betray the guild, but to sin before heaven. The strength of these oaths was tested many times. When famine struck, when nobles demanded higher taxes, when kings ordered guild privileges stripped away, the brothers stood together. If one member fell into poverty, the guild supported him. If one was wrongfully accused, the guild defended him in court. If one was harmed, the guild might rise in anger, sending dozens, even hundreds of men to demand justice. It was said that a man without a guild was like a man without a country, vulnerable and powerless. But a man with a guild stood taller than kings. For while a king could command armies, the guild commanded loyalty of heart, and that was a power no crown could purchase. What set guild oaths apart from feudal obligations was equality. A knight might serve a lord because he was bound by law or compelled by fear, but a guild brother served because he had chosen, and because his fellows had chosen him. Within the guild, there were ranks apprentices, journeymen, masters, but all were united under the same oath. A master could not cheat an apprentice without shame. A journeyman could not betray his fellows without consequence. Even the greatest merchant or craftsman was subject to the guild's will. Thus, the oath created not merely obedience but solidarity, and solidarity is a weapon sharper than any sword. In many cities, the guild oath held more weight than the king's own laws. When disputes arose, men turned not to royal courts but to guild councils. The judgments of guild masters were considered final, and to ignore them was to cut oneself off from the very lifeblood of commerce and trade. A king might decree, but if the guilds disagreed, his words were worth little. What monarch could enforce his will when bakers refused to bake, masons refused to build, or merchants refused to sell? It was the oaths of the guild that ensured such unity of action, for no brother dared defy the bond he had sworn upon his soul. Thus the guilds became invisible, kingdoms within kingdoms. Their walls were not of stone but of vows. Their guards were not soldiers, but brothers who watched over one another. Their treasure was not only gold, but the trust that no member would betray the secrets of the craft. This invisible fortress was impenetrable, for how can one breach loyalty sworn before God? Kings envied it, priests admired it, and common folk relied upon it, though they scarcely understood its depth. The oath was the guild's greatest weapon, its hidden shield, and its eternal secret. Gold is the blood of kingdoms, and in the Middle Ages, kings were expected to bleed often. Wars demanded soldiers, soldiers demanded pay, castles demanded stone, and courts demanded luxury. A crown might sparkle upon a ruler's head, but without gold it was nothing more than an empty ornament. Many kings discovered, to their shame, that their treasuries could be emptied in a single campaign or squandered on feasts and tournaments that left their coffers bare. In contrast, the guilds learned a different truth, that wealth was not to be spent recklessly, but guarded, multiplied, and invested. Their treasuries grew not through conquest, but through patience, through collective strength, and through the tireless work of their members. What began as small chests of coins collected from dues and fines became vaults heavy with riches, wealth so vast that even monarchs were forced to bow before it. Each guild collected dues from its members, and these payments formed the foundation of their wealth. Apprentices contributed small amounts, journeymen contributed more, and masters contributed the most. Fines for breaking guild rules added yet more gold, for discipline was strictly enforced. A man who sold poor quality goods was fined. A man who cheated his customers was fined. A man who betrayed the guild's secrets was not only expelled, but had his property confiscated. In this way, the guilds built treasuries that were not merely safe boxes for emergencies, but immense reservoirs of financial power. Unlike the scattered taxes of kings, these funds were steady, reliable, and controlled not by one man's whim, but by the collective will of the brotherhood. But guild wealth was not kept idle. Gold that lies still loses its value, and the guilds knew this well. Their treasuries were used to purchase supplies in bulk, to fund expeditions, to buy ships, to secure warehouses, and to invest in ventures that multiplied their riches. Merchant guilds pooled their resources to send caravans across Europe and fleets across the seas, each brother taking a share of the profit when the goods returned. Craft guilds invested in materials, ensuring they could weather shortages when famine or plague struck. In this way, they grew richer not only in gold but in resilience, for their collective wealth made them unshakable even in times of crisis. Kings envied this stability, for their own treasuries rose and fell like the tides, while guild wealth only deepened like the sea. The greatest secret of guild treasuries, however, was lending. Kings needed coin to wage their wars, to bribe their enemies, and to build their monuments. When their treasuries ran dry, they turned not to peasants or nobles, but to the guilds. It was guild bankers and merchant associations that lent monarchs the money they needed, often at interest, sometimes demanding privileges or trade rights in return. In these moments, the truth was clear. The crown did not rest securely upon the king's head, it rested upon the gold of the guilds. Monarchs who could not pay their debts became pawns, forced to grant concessions or privileges to those who held their purse strings. Behind every victorious army, behind every glittering crown, often stood a guild counting its profits. The Hanseatic League, a great confederation of merchant guilds, became so wealthy that its coffers rivaled entire kingdoms. Its members controlled the flow of fish from the North Sea, grain from the Baltic, furs from Russia, and salt from Iberia. With their combined wealth, they bought fleets of ships, fortified their ports, and hired mercenaries to defend their interests. Kings who sought to challenge them often found themselves defeated not by swords but by silver. For when a guild shut its warehouses or withdrew its merchants, a city starved, and when it starved, rebellion was never far behind. Thus, the guilds discovered the most subtle form of power, the ability to control a kingdom's fate. With a stroke of the quill in a ledger, their treasuries were guarded as fiercely as any fortress. Locked chests, iron keys, guarded rooms, and even hidden vaults beneath churches or guild halls held their wealth. Only trusted masters had access, and each coin was accounted for. Unlike royal treasuries, which could be plundered in times of war or seized by ambitious lords, guild treasuries were scattered, concealed, and defended by secrecy. It was whispered that some guilds kept reserves so well hidden that even kings could not discover them, and when monarchs fell into debt, they suspected that the guilds had more gold than entire realms combined. Whether these whispers were true or not, they gave the guilds a mystique of power. For in the Middle Ages, belief was often as mighty as reality. The guilds also displayed their wealth in ways that reinforced their prestige. They built guild halls that rivaled palaces, adorned with carvings, stained glass, and towering chambers. These were not mere meeting places, they were symbols of authority, announcing to all who entered the city that the guilds stood as powers equal to lords and princes. Within these halls, treasuries were counted, decisions were made, and alliances were forged. The walls of the guild hall were as sacred to a brother as the walls of a cathedral, for within them lay the lifeblood of his craft and his future. Even the church felt the weight of guild wealth. Guilds poured gold into chapels, altars, and cathedrals, often purchasing entire shrines dedicated to their patron saints. A bishop might bless a king, but he depended upon guilds to fund the construction of his churches. Monks prayed for divine favor, but they wore vestments woven by guild weavers, their candles lit by guild chandlers, their chalices forged by guild goldsmiths. Thus, guild wealth became interwoven with the spiritual life of Europe, ensuring that even priests would hesitate to oppose them. If the church was the soul of the medieval world, the guilds were its purse, and no soul could long survive without the support of gold. The guild treasuries also served as vaults of charity, though charity in the guild sense was never free. Brothers supported one another in times of need, widows were given aid, and orphans were sometimes apprenticed to continue the legacy of their fathers. But these acts of generosity were carefully controlled, reinforcing loyalty to the guild. A man who received aid knew it was not the king who had saved him, nor the church, but his brothers. This gratitude cemented the guild's strength, for no tax collector could inspire such devotion. Kings feared guild wealth because it made them dependent. In times of war, when monarchs rode out to claim glory, their armies were often fed with bread baked by guild bakers, armed with swords forged by guild smiths, and carried on ships built by guild carpenters. All of this required payment, and if the king's treasury failed, the guild could choose whether to extend credit or to withhold it. A guild that withheld support could doom a campaign before it began. Thus, the battlefield was not won only with steel, but with the quiet power of gold. Guild treasuries grew so vast that they reshaped the politics of entire regions. In Florence, the bankers' guilds became so influential that they dictated the policies of the Republic, their gold controlling not only the economy but the very fate of the city-state. In Flanders, the weavers' guilds grew rich on cloth, funding armies that defied dukes. In London, guilds financed bridges, markets, and fortifications, ensuring the prosperity of the city while increasing their hold upon it. Again and again, history shows that wherever guilds gathered wealth, kings were forced to acknowledge them not as subjects but as rivals. This wealth also gave the guilds patience. Kings were bound by lifespans, their reigns often short and turbulent, but guilds endured across generations. A monarch might rise and fall in a matter of decades, yet the guild treasury only grew, its profits carefully guarded and passed down. Thus, the guilds wielded the advantage of time, a slow, steady accumulation of riches that no crown could match. Gold was their weapon and patience their shield. In this way, they outlasted dynasties and carved their names into history not with swords, but with ledgers. The hidden truth of the Middle Ages is that while kings ruled in appearance, it was guilds who ruled in substance. A monarch could decree, but without guild gold, his decree often withered. A monarch could dream, but without guild support, his dream often remained only a shadow. The treasuries of the guilds were silent thrones, and upon those thrones sat not crowned rulers, but masters of craft, merchants of vision, and brothers bound by oath. Their crowns were invisible, but their power was undeniable. And so, as Europe marched onward into the 13th and 14th centuries, the guilds stood not merely as associations of workers, but as financial titans. Their gold purchased influence, their gold purchased loyalty, and their gold purchased the future. Kings might win glory on the battlefield, but the guilds won something greater, control of the very lifeblood of kingdoms. This was the secret of their treasuries, a secret so vast, so enduring, that even now, centuries later, its echoes remain in the banks, corporations, and unions that trace their ancestry to those brotherhoods of the medieval world. Knowledge is a treasure more enduring than gold, for gold may be spent, stolen, or melted away. But knowledge, once mastered, can be passed on endlessly, shaping the destiny of generations. The guilds of the Middle Ages understood this truth more deeply than most. And while kings chased after lands and plunder, guilds guarded something far more precious: the mastery of their crafts, the secrets of their trades, and the hidden lore that made them indispensable to society. To a king, a crown symbolized authority, but to a guild, a set of guarded formulas or techniques symbolized survival, wealth, and power. The secrecy of the guilds was not mere superstition, it was the very foundation of their dominance. For in a world where knowledge was rare and scattered, to keep a craft secret was to hold the key to prosperity. Apprenticeship was the first barrier to this secret vault. A boy who entered a guild as an apprentice submitted himself to years of strict discipline, labor, and silence. He watched, he worked, but he did not fully learn, for the deepest secrets were never given freely. Only when he had proven his loyalty, his patience, and his worth was he allowed to glimpse the guarded heart of the craft. Techniques of forging. Steel so fine that it could cut armor, recipes for dyes that gleamed with colors unseen elsewhere. Formulas for glass that shone with unmatched clarity, these were whispered only from master. To apprentice in the darkest hours, often sealed by oaths taken on sacred relics. To betray such secrets was to invite ruin, for the guilds punished betrayal with exile, disgrace, or even worse. A king might threaten torture, but even under such pressure many guild members held their silence, knowing that their loyalty to the brotherhood outweighed any loyalty to crown or throne. This secrecy gave guilds power far beyond their numbers. The stonemasons who built cathedrals carried with them geometry, architecture, and knowledge of engineering that no king possessed. Their lodges became schools of silent wisdom, where symbols and codes were passed down through generations, veiling practical science in mystery so that only initiates could unlock it. Similarly, alchemists, apothecaries, and physicians within their guilds guarded recipes for medicines, tonics, and remedies that could cure diseases or preserve life. To the common people, such men seemed almost magical, and to kings, they were indispensable. For what monarch would not humble himself before the guild that could heal his wounds, build his fortresses, or furnish his armies with weapons of unmatched quality? Thus, knowledge became a chain binding rulers to guilds. The scribes' guilds, though smaller in number, wielded enormous influence by controlling the flow of written words. In a world where most were illiterate, scribes copied laws, contracts, and chronicles. Their pens preserved memory and dictated truth. If a king needed a treaty, he relied on scribes. If the church needed scripture copied, it turned to guild-trained hands. In this way, knowledge became a form of currency, and the guilds became the bankers of wisdom, lending their skills to monarchs but never relinquishing control. Even as kings rode forth with armies, they could not escape the quiet dominion of the guilds whose secrets lay behind every brick, every weapon, every page. The merchants' guilds, too, possessed knowledge that gave them power. They knew the hidden routes across mountains, the safe harbors along coasts, the rhythms of trade winds, and the markets where goods could be sold for double their value. This intelligence was shared only among their brothers, written in secret ledgers that kings could not read. To control trade was to control survival, for no kingdom could live without grain, salt, iron, or cloth. Thus, the knowledge of where and how to move these goods was as valuable as the goods themselves. More than once, a monarch who dared to defy the guilds found his ports mysteriously empty, his markets barren, and his armies hungry. Behind these calamities was not chance, but calculation, the silent enforcement of guild power through their hidden knowledge of trade. The church, the mighty, also recognized the value of guild knowledge. Many monasteries trained craftsmen, but the most skilled often belonged to guilds, and their methods could not be imitated. When a cathedral rose toward heaven, its soaring arches and stained glass windows testified not only to divine glory, but to the secret geometry of masons and glaziers. Bishops might bless the work, but they knew that without guild knowledge the stones would collapse, the windows would shatter, and the great house of God would stand as a ruin. Thus, even the church, guardian of souls, depended on the guilds, guardians of craft. The fear of guild secrets reached even into courts. Kings and nobles often tried to lure guild masters into revealing their knowledge, offering titles, land, or gold. Some masters yielded, but many refused, for they knew that once the knowledge was given freely, their power would vanish. Better to remain a humble craftsman with secrets intact than to be a noble robbed of them. And so, guild members often lived outwardly modest lives, their true wealth hidden not in their purses, but in the skills that no king could buy. This monopoly on knowledge also bred legends. It was whispered that masons possessed occult wisdom handed down from Solomon's temple, that goldsmiths knew alchemy, that shipwrights could summon winds with chance. Such stories, though exaggerated, served the guilds well, cloaking their knowledge in awe and fear. Kings who might otherwise have tried to seize their secrets hesitated, for to offend a guild rumored to hold divine or mystical power was to invite misfortune. Thus, rumor itself became a shield, protecting guild knowledge from intrusion. In time, this hoarding of knowledge gave rise to a hidden network that stretched across Europe. A mason in France could find work in England. A weaver in Flanders could seek shelter in Italy, for their knowledge was recognized by brothers in every land. Symbols, handshakes, and coded words allowed guild members to identify one another, granting them a secret fraternity that transcended borders. This invisible web of shared knowledge was a power kings could neither control nor fully perceive. It was a shadow empire of wisdom, stronger than armies because it endured quietly, invisibly, in the minds and hands of men. Thus, the guilds became more than associations of workers. They became keepers of civilization's secrets. Their guarded knowledge shaped the cities, economies, and even the faith of Europe, while kings sat upon thrones that time would soon topple. Guilds passed their secrets from hand to hand, ensuring their survival across centuries. Their gold bought influence, but their knowledge secured immortality. For though kingdoms fall and crowns shatter, skill and craft remain. In this truth lay the deepest secret of all, that kings might rule for a season, but guild knowledge ruled for eternity. Justice in the Middle Ages was often brutal, uncertain, and swayed by power. Kings claimed to be the source of law, lords claimed the right to judge their vassals, and the church claimed to govern the soul. Yet for the common man, none of these powers offered consistent fairness. A poor craftsman wronged by a noble had little hope in the king's court, for coin and bloodline outweighed truth. But within the walls of the guild halls, a different form of justice took root, secret, strict, and relentless. Here were the shadow courts of the guild's tribunals held not beneath banners of kings, but beneath the crests of trades where masters judged not by whim, but by ancient codes and wear. The verdicts struck harder than the decrees of monarchs. These courts existed because the guilds could not entrust their affairs to outsiders. A king's judge did not understand the worth of a flawed blade, the danger of watered wine, or the crime of stolen craft. Only brothers knew the value of their work, and only brothers had the right to decide punishment. Thus, the guilds built courts within their halls, often in chambers lit only by candles, where elders sat in silence as complainants brought forth their grievances. An apprentice might accuse a master of cruelty, a master might accuse another of theft, a customer might accuse a brother of dishonesty. In every case, the shadow court listened, deliberated, and delivered judgment. The power of these rulings was immense. To be fined by a king's court meant paying coin. To be condemned by a guild's court meant losing livelihood, reputation, and sometimes exile. A craftsman expelled from his guild could not work, could not sell, could not buy supplies, and could not survive. The punishment was economic death, worse than imprisonment, for it cut a man off from the brotherhood that gave him meaning. Some guilds even marked offenders, ensuring that all who saw them would know of their disgrace. Such was the terror of the shadow courts that many obeyed guild law, with more devotion than royal decrees, for kings could take a man's land, but guilds could take his very life's purpose. Guild courts did not only punish individuals, they also decided disputes between merchants and between cities, when caravans clashed, when trade agreements faltered, or when partners accused one another of deceit. It was often the guilds who resolved the matter. Kings might war over borders, but guilds quietly judged the flow of trade, and their rulings determined who prospered and who fell into ruin. In some regions, merchants refused to appeal to kings at all, trusting only the impartiality of the guilds, whose interest lay not in politics but in preserving order and profit. Thus, the shadow courts became not only arbiters of craft, but arbiters of commerce itself. In their Secrecy lay their strength, proceedings were not recorded for outsiders, and oaths bound all present to silence. Masters spoke in measured tones, decisions were made behind closed doors, and only the outcome was revealed. To break the secrecy of a guild court was to betray the brotherhood, and such betrayal was punished more severely than theft or violence. Kings suspected what was happening behind the Guildhall doors but could seldom prove it. To them, the shadow courts were an affront, a rival throne hidden within the city walls, dispensing justice without crown or cross, yet they dared not interfere too boldly, for they knew that guild unity was a wall harder to break than any fortress. The greatest strength of these courts was that they were feared and respected alike. Merchants trusted them, craftsmen obeyed them, and even nobles sometimes submitted to their arbitration. A knight might sneer at a cobbler in the street, but when his armor failed him in battle and he sought compensation, it was the guild's judgment he relied upon. The paradox of the guild courts was that they held no armies, no royal seals, no divine anointing, and yet their word carried more weight than that of kings. For in the end, power does not rest in titles but in the ability to enforce obedience, and the guilds, with their grip on livelihood and trade, enforced obedience with ruthless efficiency. Some whispered that the guild courts went further than justice in times of strife. When kings grew hostile or nobles grew oppressive, the shadow courts became councils of resistance. Decisions made in those dim-lit halls shaped rebellions, strikes, and uprisings. The guilds did not fight recklessly, but when they judged that tyranny had gone too far, their verdict was war. Cities closed their gates, trade routes shifted, and armed men rose under banners not of kings but of trades. Thus, the shadow courts, in silence and secrecy, directed the fate of kingdoms. What frightened monarchs most was that they could not control these hidden tribunals. A king might crush a rebellion, might burn a town, but he could not extinguish the secret judgments passed from master to master, from hall to hall. Wherever a guild gathered, the court existed. Wherever a brotherhood swore its oath, the court had authority. It was an invisible empire of justice, flowing beneath the surface of Europe like a river unseen but unstoppable. In time, kings learned that to rule effectively, they had to negotiate with guilds, to bend their laws around the guild codes, and to respect the rulings of the shadow courts. It was humiliating for some, enraging for others, but unavoidable for all. For while thrones could command armies, they could not command bread without bakers, weapons without smiths, or ships without carpenters. And the bakers, smiths, and carpenters all bowed not to kings but to their guilds, whose secret courts judged them more truly than any monarch. Thus, the shadow courts stood as the quiet rivals of royal justice, hidden thrones of law where crowns had no power. And as their candles burned deep into the night, the masters who sat in judgment knew a truth that kings dared not admit. That true rule is not written in decrees or carved into seals, but lived out in the hearts and hands of men bound by brotherhood. Power without force is always fragile, and the guilds of the Middle Ages understood that sooner or later wealth and knowledge would invite the sword. Kings ruled with armies, nobles with retinues, and the church with spiritual fear, but guilds, if they wished to protect their treasuries and their secrets, had to raise strength of their own. Thus were born the armies of the guilds, not great standing forces like royal hosts, but militias, companies and mercenary bands loyal not to crowns but to crafts, not to nobles but to brotherhoods. In the streets of medieval cities, when banners of trade were unfurled and bells rang from guild halls, men marched not as peasants or soldiers but as brothers under oath, and their steel gave weight to the silent power of guild law. At first, these forces appeared as simple watchmen. Cities relied on guild members to patrol streets, guard markets, and protect caravans. But gradually, what began as watchful defense grew into organized militias. The weavers of Flanders, rich from their cloth, armed themselves with pikes and halberds, forming disciplined companies that no band of raiders could withstand. The Butchers' Guild of many towns, feared for their strength, became the backbone of urban militias, their cleavers replaced by axes of war. Shipwrights and sailors, hardened by storms, formed naval bands that could defend harbors against pirates and even royal fleets. Thus, across Europe, Guilds transformed from peaceful associations of trade into potential armies hidden within the walls of cities. Kings discovered this to their alarm when they attempted to enforce their will by force. More than once, royal soldiers entered a town only to find its gates barred and its walls manned by guild militias. Battles were fought not upon open fields but in cobbled streets, where craftsmen defended their homes and halls with the fury of men fighting for livelihood and brotherhood. These were not peasants forced into service, but men with wealth, pride, and discipline, who fought with the knowledge that defeat meant not just death, but the loss of all they had built. A king might crush a rebellion of serfs, but to confront a guild militia was to confront an organized, armed, and often well-funded force. Wealth gave the guilds another weapon: mercenaries. Where kings sometimes lacked coin to pay their armies, guilds, with their vast treasuries, could hire companies of hardened soldiers. The free companies that roamed Europe, feared and hated for their brutality, often found employment in service to guilds who wished to protect trade routes or intimidate rivals. In Italy, merchant guilds hired condottieri, professional captains who commanded seasoned men-at-arms, making guild-led city-states formidable powers. Thus, gold and steel joined hands, and guilds became military players in a world where might often decided fate. The armies of the guilds were not merely defensive, they were political tools. When a lord raised taxes unfairly, guild militias marched. When a king sought to strip privileges, guild forces rallied. Sometimes they fought openly in sieges and battles. More often, they simply showed their strength. A silent army assembling in a marketplace, hundreds of craftsmen bearing arms while their banners waved. This sight alone was enough to make rulers hesitate, for no monarch could easily spill the blood of the very men who fed his cities, clothed his armies, and built his fortresses. Force without legitimacy breeds rebellion, and guild armies gave rebellion form. These militias also fought for their cities in times of external threat. When foreign invaders threatened, it was often guild militias who manned the walls first, defending their homes with grim determination. In Flanders, weavers and fullers clashed with French knights, and through sheer discipline and unity, won victories that astonished Europe. In the Hanseatic League, merchant guilds armed fleets of ships, their sailors fighting not for a king's glory, but for the safety of their trade. Their banners bore no crowns but symbols of fish, grain, and hammers, yet their ships struck fear into enemies who soon realized that trade defended by brotherhood was as formidable as any royal navy. What terrified monarchs most was not just the existence of these guild armies, but their loyalty. Kings commanded soldiers with coin, lords commanded vassals with land, but guilds commanded their militias with oath and pride. A man who fought for his guild fought for his family, his craft, and his identity. To him, the guild hall was more sacred than the throne, and the guild banner more holy than the royal standard. Such loyalty could not be bought nor easily broken. Defeating such men required not only victory in battle, but destruction of their entire way of life. Kings soon learned that it was often easier to negotiate with guilds than to confront them in arms. Yet the guilds were not reckless in wielding force. Violence was costly, bloody, and dangerous to trade, and so their armies were often the last resort, used only when negotiations failed. But the very knowledge that these armies existed, hidden in plain sight, gave guilds leverage at every table. When masters spoke in the halls of kings, their words carried the weight of unseen soldiers, of armed craftsmen ready to rise at a moment's call. Kings, bishops, and nobles knew it, and this unspoken truth tilted the balance of power toward the guilds again and again. Thus, the armies of the guilds stood as the iron shield behind their gold and knowledge. Silent most of the time, they were the unyielding force that made guild law unbreakable and guild wealth untouchable. They did not conquer empires, but they defended their cities, their trades, and their brotherhoods with a strength that even monarchs envied. In the balance of medieval power, crowns gleamed brightly, but beneath them marched the guild armies, steel in hand, pride in heart, and loyalty unshaken, reminding the world that no king could rule without reckoning with the brotherhoods who had forged their own strength in both craft and war. Power rarely remains in the shadows forever, and the guilds that had grown rich in gold, strong in knowledge, and disciplined in arms eventually found themselves no longer content to merely defend what they held. The age of quiet dominance gave way to one of open defiance, when guilds began to test the limits of kingship itself. It was not always through battle or bloodshed. Often it was through the subtler war of influence, a war fought in councils, in markets, in sealed letters, and at feasting tables where kings discovered that they were not the only rulers of men. For guilds, united and determined, could command not only craftsmen but cities, and to rule cities was to rule the wealth that fed kingdoms. The first battlefield of this war was taxation. Monarchs, forever hungry for coin to feed wars and courts, turned to prosperous towns and demanded tribute. But guilds, who guarded the purses of their members with jealous vigilance, resisted. In Flanders, the cloth guilds defied French kings, refusing unjust levies. And when soldiers marched to enforce the crown's will, the weavers' militias rose in arms. The streets of Bruges and Ghent saw uprisings where banners of trade fluttered above barricades, and knights found themselves cut down by men who wielded pikes with the discipline of soldiers. The victory of common craftsmen over mounted nobles at battles like Courtrai was not just a clash of arms, it was a declaration that guilds could resist crowns and triumph. Elsewhere, the war of influence was more subtle but no less potent. In Italy, merchant guilds particularly, in Florence and Venice, wielded such financial power that kings and emperors borrowed from them. To a monarch in need of coin, a guild could act as savior or executioner. Loans bought influence, and defaulting monarchs discovered their authority undermined by the very creditors who had once enabled them. A guild could fund a rival prince, close a trade route, or starve a royal treasury. Thus, crowns glittered brightly but hung precariously on the strings of guild-led purses. Kings were reminded again and again that even a throne required the approval of merchants, who controlled the lifeblood of gold. The war of influence was not only economic but political. Many cities granted guilds a voice in governance, and once within the halls of councils, their influence grew like ivy on stone. Soon guild leaders, elected by craftsmen, spoke with authority equal to nobles. They passed laws, levied fines, and directed city policy. In many towns, kings found themselves negotiating not with a single lord but with a collective of guild masters, whose unity made them formidable. In such cities, guild charters were guarded more fiercely than royal decrees, and no monarch dared strip away privileges without risking revolt. The shadow of the guild banners loomed over thrones, a silent reminder that the voice of craftsmen could roar like thunder if ignored. What made guild influence terrifying to monarchs was its permanence. A noble family could die out, a king could be overthrown, but guilds endured, passing from master to apprentice across generations. Kings who sought to crush them often found that, even after victory, guilds re-emerged like roots from the soil, restored by the bonds of craft and brotherhood. To destroy them utterly required destroying the trade and prosperity of entire cities, a task no wise king could afford. Thus, guilds played a long game, patient and relentless, knowing that crowns might change, but their own power remained. In many lands, the war of influence ended not in blood but in compromise. Kings granted guilds charters, recognizing their privileges in exchange for loyalty or coin. Some monarchs sought to turn guilds into allies, bestowing honors and rights, while others simmered in resentment at their power. But the truth was undeniable. No ruler could govern a city without its guilds. When walls needed repairing, when ships needed building, when armies needed supplies, it was guilds who provided. Their influence, woven into the very fabric of daily life, was unshakable. The more monarchs relied on them, the deeper their authority spread. And yet, guilds were not merely defensive or reactive, they could act with ambition equal to kings. In some cases, guilds toppled rulers outright. Uprisings led by guilds forced princes to flee their own palaces, while in other towns, guild councils replaced noble governments altogether, ruling in the name of craftsmen rather than crowns. These were not mere revolts of the poor, but organized seizures of power, legitimized by the wealth and strength of guild members. To kings, such events were terrifying, for they revealed that their crowns were not sacred but conditional, dependent on the silent acceptance of the men who forged, brewed, built, and traded beneath them. Thus, the war of influence raged across Europe, sometimes in battles, sometimes in ledgers, sometimes in whispers behind council doors. It was a war where victory was not marked by coronations or treaties, but by the quiet endurance of privileges, the survival of charters, and the growing confidence of brotherhoods who knew themselves to be stronger than kings. By the time many monarchs recognized the depth of this influence, it was too late. Guilds had already woven themselves into the foundations of cities, into the treasuries of realms, and into the very souls of the people. No sword could cut so deep, no crown could shine so bright. Thus ended the 7th chapter of the hidden story, the war not of blades alone, but of wills, where guilds proved that true power was not always seated upon a throne, but could be carried in the hands of craftsmen, whispered in the halls of merchants, and wielded by the unseen armies of influence. Though guilds were powerful within their own walls, the true brilliance of their strength was revealed when they learned to look beyond the borders of their cities and kingdoms. A single guild could resist a king, but many guilds united could defy empires. Thus began the weaving of secret alliances, threads of loyalty that crossed mountains, rivers, and seas, binding men of craft and trade into a brotherhood that no monarch could fully unravel. These alliances were rarely proclaimed in open treaties, for kings would never permit such oaths of independence. Instead, they were sworn in quiet chambers, sealed by handshakes and sacred signs, and remembered in the hearts of masters and apprentices, who saw themselves not only as members of a single town, but as part of a vast unseen empire of guilds. The Hanseatic League was perhaps the most visible expression of such power, a network of merchant guilds stretching across the North Sea and the Baltic. Ships bearing the League's mark sailed from London to Novgorod, carrying goods under the protection of an invisible banner. Though no king ruled the League, its merchants commanded fleets, armies, and the wealth of entire regions. Kings and princes learned to treat with them as equals, for to offend the League was to risk trade embargoes that could starve kingdoms of silver, cloth, and salt. But the Hanseatic League was only one face of a wider truth that everywhere, guilds were forming bonds that transcended borders, creating a hidden web of power that stretched further than any crown. Within this web, secrets were exchanged as readily as goods. A master mason in France could send word to a fellow in Germany about new techniques of stone cutting, and within weeks those methods were known across half of Europe. A brewer in Flanders might share a guarded recipe with a brother in England, who would protect it as though it were scripture. These exchanges were cloaked in oaths and symbols, so that outsiders never knew the depth of the knowledge shared. To kings, such networks were invisible, but they existed nonetheless, flowing beneath the surface like a hidden river that nourished and connected all who drank from it. The alliances were not only of trade but of politics. When one guild was threatened, others often came to its aid. If a king sought to crush the privileges of weavers in one city, guilds in another might close their markets to his envoys or raise funds for resistance. There were cases where entire regions were bound together in silent defiance, their guilds acting as one body against the greed of a monarch. Such solidarity terrified rulers, for it revealed that they were no longer dealing with isolated groups but with a vast brotherhood that could reach across borders more effectively than any royal messenger. Symbols and signs played a vital role in these hidden bonds. Guild members carried tokens, passwords, and handshakes known only to their brethren. In an age where travel was dangerous and strangers were distrusted, these marks ensured that a craftsman could find shelter, work, and loyalty in a foreign land. To kings and nobles, who relied on heraldry and bloodlines, such symbols were incomprehensible. They were the language of a hidden empire, spoken only by those who labored with skill and discipline. Thus, even as monarchs boasted of borders and crowns, guilds walked freely through the invisible highways of trust that linked city to city, hall to hall, brother to brother. It was in these alliances that the guilds discovered their greatest security. No king, no matter how mighty, could subdue an entire continent of brotherhoods. He might break one city, burn one guild hall, or scatter one militia, but elsewhere guilds endured, waiting, watching, and offering refuge to those displaced. In this way, guilds achieved what monarchs so often failed to do. They created unity that survived beyond dynasties, where kingdoms fractured through war and succession. Guild bonds endured for centuries, renewed with each generation of apprentices sworn into the brotherhood. But the alliances were not merely defensive. They allowed guilds to extend their reach, to dominate trade routes, and to dictate the flow of wealth across Europe. A king might levy tolls on a road, but if the guilds chose another path, his toll houses fell silent. A prince might build a harbour, but if the guild fleets avoided it, the harbour rotted in disuse. Such choices were made in the councils of guild masters, often far from the eyes of monarchs. Yet their effects rippled through kingdoms like silent commands. It was influence not of armies or decrees, but of unseen unity. And it was all the more dangerous for its silence. Thus, through secret alliances, guilds became more than associations of craftsmen. They became a network of power stretching across Europe, hidden yet undeniable, loyal to no crown but their own brotherhood. Kings feared them, for no sword could sever the invisible bonds that bound men of trade together. And as centuries passed, these alliances grew only stronger, whispering of a truth that rulers dared not speak aloud, that in the heart of medieval Europe there existed an empire without a throne, a kingdom without a king, whose strength lay not in bloodlines, but in brotherhoods united beyond borders. For centuries, the guilds had risen unchecked, gathering gold, secrets, and soldiers until their power rivaled that of monarchs. Yet no empire lasts without challenge, and the crowns of Europe, humbled again and again by the quiet strength of brotherhoods, began to turn their eyes toward vengeance. Kings who once bargained with guild masters now conspired to break them. Nobles who had endured their influence now plotted to strip them of privilege. The moment arrived when crowns decided that enough was enough, and the long, hidden war between kings and guilds erupted into open conflict. The first blows came not always with the sword, but with the pen. Monarchs issued edicts limiting guild power, declaring that charters once sacred were now void, and that privileges granted to cities were subject to royal whim. Taxes were raised not only upon goods but upon guild halls themselves, draining treasuries and forcing brotherhoods to fight in courts as well as streets. Where kings had once borrowed from guild coffers, they now seized them outright, declaring such acts the will of the crown. To the guilds, this was nothing less than theft wrapped in royal seal. To kings, it was the reclaiming of authority they believed had been stolen long ago. But edicts alone could not tame the guilds, and so force followed. Armies marched into rebellious cities, their banners raised not against foreign foes, but against their own craftsmen. Fires consumed guild halls, treasures were looted, and masters were dragged in chains to face execution or exile. In Paris, revolts of guilds were crushed beneath the boots of royal soldiers in London. Uprisings were drowned in blood by kings who feared the return of a city beyond their control. Each burned hall was meant to send a message that crowns, not craftsmen, ruled the realm. And yet, each act of violence sowed seeds of bitterness that smouldered in the hearts of survivors. The guilds fought back, of course. In Flanders, militias rose once more, defying French kings with the same courage that had carried them at Courtrai. In Italy, merchant guilds resisted emperors, raising armies of condottieri to defend their independence. But the tide had begun to shift. Monarchs were no longer scattered lords quarreling over scraps. They were becoming centralized powers, wielding national armies far larger than any guild militia. Where once a guild's force had been formidable, it now faced professional soldiers, artillery, and the full might of emerging states. Brotherhood courage could still win battles, but wars were slipping from their grasp. What truly weakened the guilds, however, was division. Wealth and power, once their strength, became their undoing. Some guilds, eager to preserve privileges, allied with kings, betraying their brethren in exchange for safety. Others grew arrogant, demanding too much from their cities, and lost the support of common people. Apprentices and journeymen, bound by oath but weary of restrictions, sometimes turned against masters who clung too tightly to power. Thus, while crowns grew stronger, guilds fractured within, their unity dissolving even as monarchs pressed harder upon them. The church, too, lent its weight to the crowns. For centuries it had tolerated guilds, even blessed them, but as guild rituals grew secretive and their influence rivaled bishops, Suspicion grew. Whispers of heresy, of forbidden rites, and of hidden knowledge spread, though many were false. They gave kings excuses to act, casting guilds as enemies not only of crowns but of God. Inquisition and law together became tools to strip them of their independence, binding them closer to royal authority and breaking the secrecy that had once been their shield. And so, city by city, hall by hall, the brotherhoods felt the weight of the breaking point. Fires that once symbolized prosperity now consumed their legacies. The oaths sworn in stone chambers were drowned out by the roar of royal decrees. Though guilds endured, their days of standing equal to kings were waning. They remained respected, yes, but increasingly bound by law. Their armies disbanded, their alliances severed, their wealth taxed beyond reach. No longer shadows that terrified monarchs, they were being transformed into tools of state. Their independence clipped like wings of a once proud falcon. Yet, even in decline, the guilds did not vanish. Their spirit lingered, stubborn as the stone halls they had built. Kings might break their armies, seize their treasuries, and scatter their councils. But the memory of their power lived on, carried by apprentices who still whispered of oaths and secrets, of a time when craftsmen stood higher than crowns. That memory would not die easily, and in it lay the seeds of a legacy that would stretch beyond the medieval world, long after kings and guilds alike had faded into history. Thus, the breaking point was not the end but the turning of an age. The crowns had won their war, but they could not erase what the brotherhoods had created. Their influence, though battered, still shaped cities, economies, and the very structure of power itself. And though the banners of guild armies no longer flew over battlefields, the echo of their march remained, a ghost in the corridors of history, reminding rulers that once, for a time, craftsmen had stood as equals to kings. The crowns may have claimed victory, but the guilds did not die. Their banners may no longer have flown from the towers of cities. Their militias may no longer have marched in defiance of royal decree, but their memory and their ways endured, carried forward like embers hidden beneath ashes. In the centuries that followed their breaking, guilds transformed, adapted, and sometimes disappeared in name, yet their spirit remained woven into the very fabric of civilization. The legacy of the guilds was not one of ruin, but of transformation, and it reached far beyond the medieval world into the kingdoms, empires, and nations that would follow. Their first and most enduring gift was the shaping of the city itself. Medieval towns, once chaotic clusters of markets and hovels, had been disciplined and ordered by the hand of guilds. Streets had been patrolled by their militias, markets regulated by their laws, and festivals lit by their banners. Even after their decline, the structures they built endured. City councils, parliaments, and urban charters all bore the imprint of guild governance. The very idea that communities could rule themselves, not by royal blood, but by shared rules and elected representatives, was born in the guild halls of Europe. It was here that the seeds of civic freedom were sown, seeds that would one day bloom into republics. Their second gift was the mastery of knowledge. The guarded secrets of their crafts formulas, recipes, blueprints were too valuable to vanish. Over time, as monarchs subdued the guilds, much of this knowledge spread into universities, laboratories and workshops. Alchemy turned to chemistry, masonry to architecture, metallurgy to industry. The spirit of learning, once confined to cloistered halls of monks, now flowed through the apprenticeships of guilds into the engines of the modern world. Every cathedral, every bridge, every clock tower still whispered of guilds that had once guarded such knowledge, as though it were treasure. Their legacy was not only in stone and steel, but in the methods of teaching, of passing knowledge from master to apprentice, generation to generation, until it became the foundation of modern education. Wealth, too, bore their mark. The treasuries of guilds may have been emptied by kings, but the practices they pioneered, collective funds, loans, insurance, did not vanish. From the merchants of the Hanseatic League sprang the roots of modern banking. From the pooling of resources to protect members arose the first seeds of corporations. Even today, the stock exchanges, the chambers of commerce, the very concept of economic associations echo the old guild practices. Monarchs may have stolen their gold, but they could not erase the systems by which the gold had been gathered and guarded. Thus, long after crowns had crumbled, The ghost of guild coffers lived on in banks and companies that rule economies still. Their influence also shaped the working man's fight for dignity. Though the medieval guilds had fallen, their memory lived among craftsmen and labourers who remembered a time when unity gave them power over lords and kings. Centuries later, when industrial machines reduced men to cogs, it was to the memory of guilds that workers turned. Trade unions, striking for fair wages and safe conditions, were heirs of that older brotherhood. The language of solidarity, of brother standing by brother, of banners raised for justice, was born in the medieval guilds. Even in the modern world, when workers march with banners, they walk in the footsteps of guildsmen who once defied kings in the streets of Bruges or Florence. But perhaps the most profound legacy was cultural. Guilds were not only associations of work, they were associations of identity, faith and pride. Their festivals, their processions, their patron Saint Saul became woven into the culture of towns and nations. The Guildhall became the heart of the city, a place where stories were told, plays performed, feasts celebrated. Even after their political power waned, the traditions they had nurtured endured. Carnival processions, craft fairs, and city festivals across Europe still carry echoes of guild banners and brotherhood gatherings. In this way, guilds outlived crowns not through force or wealth but through memory and culture, which no king could extinguish. Yet their legacy carried darker shadows as well. The secrecy that once protected them also gave rise to suspicion and myth, whispers of hidden knowledge, of forbidden rituals, of secret alliances beyond the grave, followed their memory into later centuries. Some saw in their symbols and oaths the roots of shadowy societies, hidden orders that continued the guild's work in silence. Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and countless other brotherhoods were said to descend from the old guild traditions, inheritors of mysteries that kings had never broken. Whether these claims were true or not, the very persistence of such legends proved how deeply guild secrecy had carved itself into the imagination of mankind. The guilds may have fallen as open powers, but in secret they were believed to live forever. The crowns that once sought to destroy them are long gone, their kingdoms fractured, their dynasties forgotten. But the guilds, though humbled, survive in every contract signed between workers, in every building raised by collective skill, in every vote cast in a council hall. The modern world, with its corporations and unions, its parliaments and banks, owes as much to the guilds as it does to kings. Their shadow still lingers in ways unseen, more enduring than any crown of gold. For kings ruled for a time, but guilds shaped the very structures by which men still live. And so the story ends not with crowns triumphant or guild banners flying, but with a legacy shared, woven into the marrow of history. The guilds, those secret brotherhoods more powerful than kings, did not vanish. They became the unseen architects of the world that followed. In their oaths was born solidarity. In their treasuries was born commerce. In their halls was born governance. And in their secrecy was born the eternal allure of hidden power. The kings who once feared them are dust, but the guilds, though changed, endure still in stone, in law, in labour, and in legend. Thus the hidden secrets of the medieval guilds, more powerful than kings, live on not as relics but as foundations. They remind us that true power does not always wear a crown, nor sit upon a throne. Sometimes it dwells in brotherhood, in the joining of hands, in the loyalty of men to one another. That was the secret of the guilds, and it is their gift to the ages. That power shared among brothers can outlast even the mightiest of kings.